The first weekend of the OHL season, regular season that is, now in the books. And Dan Mahar, I've got just one question I want to ask after the first weekend. And the question is this. Can I change my predictions? Like last week, the last 2 weeks, we were doing predictions. I want to know now, like, is it okay? Is it early enough for me to say I changed my mind on this, that, or the other thing? Can I change my predictions, Dan Mahar?
No, they're
No?
iron. They're ironclad, Mike. They're carved in stone. Although I will say, nothing that happens this time of year matters too much, right?
Uh, Probably not, but you're still a jerk for not allowing me to take, I don't know, the team I had missing the playoffs in the West and maybe at minimum move them into a playoff position. That team being the Windsor Spitfires. You, along with several others, Dan, identified something with the team. And to your point that you just made, it is early, and we'll talk more about that as sort of a central theme in this episode of the OHL podcast. But you saw something in the Spits, and boy, oh boy, including Ethan Belchetz, who you mentioned, you singled him out in your predictions last week. What a show that young man and that young hockey team in Windsor put on this weekend in their home opener.
Indeed, and yeah, I last year, sometimes previous years give you a kind of warped sense of what a team is, and I think a lot went wrong there last year, and they've you know what a difference a year makes in the OHL, right? With the players aging up a year, adding some new players. I just thought there's just oodles of talent, size, you name it on that team. Great new coaching, a desire to kind of right wrongs from last year. I saw an awful lot that could go right in Windsor this year, and you named it with Ethan Belchetz. I mean, that name's right at the top of the list with what he brings to the table.
I think now we have to call it. I put this out on Twitter at Farwell underscore OHL, which is where you'll find me. You'll find Dan at his name at Dan Mahar. We all know what the Gordie Howe hat trick is, right? If you follow this game, you know a Gordie Howe hat trick is a game during which you score a goal, you have an assist, and you get into a fight. That is the long-standing, understood definition of Gordie Howe hat trick. So when I put this out on Twitter to ask, what do you call what Ethan Belchetz did on Saturday, which was record an assist and then added another, get into a fight, and not just score one goal, but score a hat trick plus one goal. So 4 goals, 2 assists, 1 fight. Somebody suggested you call it the How You Doing, HOWE, in honor of Gordy. Somebody else said from now on, they're just calling this the Belchetz. You know what? I think that's what I'm going to go with. We now have the Ethan Belchetz hat trick, which is 4 goals, 2 assists, and a fight in the same game. Dan, he's 16 years old. He has played 3 Ontario Hockey League games. Again, you identified him during our Western Conference predictions last week, mentioned the preseason for what it's worth, but obviously showed well. And now into the regular season, 2 assists in his opening game, kept off the score sheet in his second game versus Sarnia and the home opener. Tell me they're not going to love, and I do mean love, this kid in Windsor for the next few years. From what I saw, again, very small sample size, 1 game only, but it was a dominant performance from a young player in just his 3rd OHL game. This is the kind of player that changes the trajectory of a franchise, in my not so humble estimation. So the Ethan Belchetz, remember, is scoring the hat trick plus the assist plus the fight in a game. We're calling that the Belchetz from now on.
Well, I think some kids that played against him in U16 last year might have seen a few Belchetzes because 84 points, 34 games. One of a number of Windsor Spitfires who are well north of 6 feet. Just going to be a load of a team to play against. And you talk about that 12-2 score they hung on the Rangers, Mike. They did that with what, one or 2 points from Liam Greentree, who's going to be probably a top 10, 12 forward in the league this year. They did it missing 2 other forwards I expect to be in the top 30 or 40 in the league this year, in AJ Spellacy and Ilya Protas, who are not back yet from NHL camps. This team is just going to be a load. And when you add a player of Belchetz's ilk to that group, I mean, it's just up front. I just see a team that is so not fun to play against night after night. And then if they get anything from the back end or goaltending, they're going to be strong. And we saw it already so far. I believe Anthony Cristoforo, another guy I said looking for a bounce back year, already at +9 in week 1. I think there's a lot going to go right in Windsor this year, and we'll see. It's a long season, but if you have the opportunity to watch this team play hockey, I think it's going to be worth it this year.
Easy enough, in fairness, to be a +9 after you run up a 12-2 score against the opposition. That's a far cry. I'm not saying he got that all in one game, obviously, but there were a couple of -6s on the Kitchener Rangers side of the ledger after that game on Saturday night. A team that's not fun to play against, as you just described, Windsor, might be the understatement of the season. And okay, fine. My predictions are etched in stone. They cannot change. I might just be offering my mea culpa a little bit early. But, as I was in the WFCU Center on Saturday night, because obviously when you broadcast the Rangers games, you go where the team goes. And I was trying to remember if there had been a game in all of my years. I've been in this league 24 years now, the last 20 of them in Kitchener covering the Rangers. And I can never remember a time that they had 12 goals scored against them. According to Josh Brown in the Waterloo Region Record, he went back as far as the OHL online database provides statistics and couldn't find one dating back to 1996. So perhaps not a 12 scored against them. And how poetic, if you will, is this, Dan? You may recall last season, Kitchener won 3 of the 4 games versus Windsor. And the 3 games the Kitchener Rangers won were by scores of 11-2, 9-2, and 6-3. Those last 2 games, 9-2 and 6-3, were a home and home, Friday in Kitchener, Saturday in Windsor. And they happened to be the final 2 games of former Spitfires coach Jared Smith's coaching career. So sports karma is a funny thing. And when it bites, it tends to bite hard. So you run up, what do we got there? 26-7 over 3 victories versus Windsor last year. And they come out in game 1 against you this year and beat you 12-2, a double-digit deficit. I just don't know how many more ways you could describe the beatdown that Windsor put on Kitchener on the weekend.
Well, yeah, and I'm one that's always said take scores with a grain of salt. You get teams, once they've kind of given up on a game and another team's rolling, the score isn't as relevant as money might think. So a 12-2 does not mean that that's what's going to happen next time. But you referenced all the scores last year, Mike, and if you don't believe hockey players have long memories, one of many reasons why I was never a fan of running up scores when we were playing teams. And it's nothing against these kids that want to get their stats up there and they want to get noticed in their draft year, want to keep rolling, want to keep playing hockey. But sometimes there's a price to pay when you embarrass teams, and when you have to face them the next year and they're getting most of their roster back and you're losing most of your players. Sometimes you're going to have to pay the piper.
It will certainly be an interesting storyline to follow because these teams, Windsor and Kitchener, face one another 3 more times this season. And to your point, Dan, it's not exactly like we're at the point of the season where we have full rosters yet, among other mitigating factors. And as I said, that's going to be a bit of a central theme of this episode of the OHL podcast. I'm just thinking on these scores, though, 11-2, 9-2, 6-3 last year, 12-2 this weekend for Windsor. They sound more like football scores than hockey scores, don't they? And allow me, if you will, to talk about football scores. TD, Tutty, in for 6. Touchdowns matter more at DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. We don't care how they score them. We want to bet on touchdowns. And DraftKings Sportsbook is delivering. Ready to place your first bet? Try betting on something simple like a player to score a touchdown. Go to the DraftKings Sportsbook app and make your pick. Just looking at it right now, this Thursday's game, Atlanta Falcons' Darnell Mooney is a +230 to score a touchdown this week. Again, those lines are subject to change, but that's where it stands right now. Ready to do a touchdown dance of your own? New DraftKings customers bet $5 to get $200 in bonus bets instantly. Score big with DraftKings Sportsbook, the number one place to bet touchdowns. Download the Sportsbook app and use code THPN. That's code THPN for new customers to get $200 in bonus bets when you bet just $5 only at DraftKings Sportsbook. The crown is yours. Everybody seemed to enjoy, well, everybody, Dan, in 19 markets in the Ontario Hockey League seemed to enjoy the London Knights' first game of the season on home ice at what is still called Budweiser Gardens, will soon be called Canada Life Place. They raised the banner from their OHL championship, and then they promptly get trounced 7-4 by the Flint Firebirds. I was feeling better about my predictions then, by the way, because I liked Flint this year. I liked what they've got. But in reality, I think we have to take a little bit of a breath here, not just this past weekend, but in the next several weeks. I don't ever want to talk about games being meaningless, but over 68 games at this time of year in particular, they kind of sort of are, aren't they? If not outright meaningless, they're certainly not representative of what I think we can expect in the next 67, 65 games for teams.
Oh, for sure. Not at all are they representative. We see it every year where a lot of kids rack up some points before a lot of the other players are back from camp, before systems are implemented, before there's a lot of video work done. Everyone's a little kind of loosey-goosey. You referenced that London Knights Flint Firebirds game. Not to take anything away from the Flint Firebirds. Great on them for hanging 7 on the Knights, but talking about a Knights team that had yet to receive Sam Dickinson, Radek Bonk, Denver Barkey, and Easton Cowan. I mean, there's some pretty good players not in that lineup for that game. So you see these things early in the year, and lineups aren't set. I think you really notice it probably about mid-November as we get in December, when teams have started to tighten up, started to work their matchups. Then it gets meaningful. But yeah, I'd say anything in the first month to 6 weeks anyway, you can kind of take with a huge grain of salt.
I think that's exactly the window we're talking about here. Probably in and around 10 to 12 or 13 games before things sort of settle down to what we're going to be seeing. And you and I talked about this during our preseason episodes of the OHL podcast, Dan, and how this is a league wherein you almost, if you will, get punished a little bit by having players that are too good. They could get taken up to the NHL after just 2 years when they're 18, if they're that good, which we're not seeing as much as we used to, but we still certainly see. You lose players over the Christmas break because they're being taken to their various countries to represent on the World Junior Hockey stage. So you don't have them available for at least a few games just before and then just after the Christmas break in this league, et cetera. So there's a small price to be paid. And to be honest with you, I was thinking about this because I saw the online celebrations, after the Knights lose their home opener, after hanging a banner and everybody, oh yeah, they're not what everybody thought they were. Well, hang on. Please remember, in this league, as Dan just described, you don't have your full roster. You don't even know what that roster is exactly going to look like. So you're trying to figure it out with, as the late, great Don Cameron, the longtime play-by-play voice of the Kitchener Rangers, would say, you've got 2 cousins and a stranger out there on the ice for a line combination, and they're just trying to figure it out. It's disappointing to me, to be honest with you, and there's nothing you can do about it. Obviously, NHL teams want to have a longer look at their property. It's probably good for the players' development to spend that time with the pro camp before coming back to junior. So that's all good. But for me, when I thought about this after seeing the weekend scores and then kind of letting this all sink in, with the Kitchener Rangers, not that they have a whole lot away at pro camps, but they have a couple of players in Edward Chalet and Trent Swick that would certainly make an impact on a young roster. Not to mention, in this particular case, the Rangers were just beaten down by a flu virus or something that ran through about half the team. Like, we're talking buckets at stalls in the dressing room. That's how sick the players were. Not to make the excuses, but that's just the reality you get sometimes. And that's the reality of this league, especially at the beginning of the season. What I really like, though, and what I've been reflecting on, is we've come into a season, Dan, where you and I have identified, and virtually anybody who follows the Ontario Hockey League has identified, that the London Knights are going to be a force to be reckoned with this year. They figure they've got 22 more seconds to perform, right? They won the OHL championship, and then with 22 seconds to go, they had the Memorial Cup winning goal scored against them. They want to make up for those 22 seconds this year. And historically, what we have seen from London is when they are a favorite, they deliver. The consistency is admirable. And I really do enjoy that pursuit of and then maintenance of excellence. So I've really been looking forward to that this year. And then, of course, they're going to have to start by, giving away almost some games because the full roster just isn't there. And it got me thinking even further back to that time, that 04-05 team that the London Knights assembled that won their first Memorial Cup. 59 wins against 7 regulation losses and 2 extra time losses. 59, 7, and 2. Dare I say, Dan, that will never, and I do mean ever, never say never, but I'm saying never, be seen again. Why? Oh, yeah. That year, there was no National Hockey League. There was a lockout. So there were players on the London Knights in 04-05 that might have been in the National League. They might have been in the American League, but those leagues weren't available to go to. So the London Knights had all of those players on the ice when we got to see in junior hockey some of the best hockey perhaps we've ever seen. And unless, I guess, there's some other work stoppage in the National Hockey League, we're not going to see something like that ever again. It's kind of sad, though.
It is, but you're right. And it's not just the players that were back because there was no NHL. It was the timing they got back too, right? We just referenced this day and age with how drawn out NHL camps are and how many bodies they keep around for extended periods. Almost every team is short players for the first few weeks. And it's not just that they lack those players' services, so they lose games for that reason. But that it takes that much longer than to build that chemistry. And we're talking about the London Knights here. And we talk about the model that Dale Hunter has used for years, and we know what that model is now. Every year, there's 4 or 5 deck chairs he has to fill. He spends the first month or 6 weeks trying to sort out who those key players are going to be, who he's going to be able to rely on. And in that feeling out period, they're vulnerable. You can get some wins on them, but come Christmas in the second half of the season, that team is firing on all cylinders. They got their trap working. They've sorted out who their go-to players are. They fixed any goaltending issues, which we've identified this year might be a little concern early. So all those things kind of ramp up. So if you're going to get your wins, get them now.
And enjoy them, because in Flint's case, they played a home and home, and the Knights went back into the Dort the night after and beat the Firebirds. But yes, get those wins now, because again, I will echo the late, great Don Cameron. And he always said, you put those points in the bank in September and October because they don't take them away from you in March and April, right? So you put them in the bank, they are yours. And we talked about this too in the context, Dan, of teams when we're trying to make our predictions. You look at the North Bays of the world, the Kitchener Rangers of the world would be probably another example. Owen Sound with all the rumors about Colby Barlow. When you're trying to project an entire season, you've got to project what they can put in the bank before they begin to dismantle the roster, and then the wins are that much harder to come by later in the season.
Oh, 100%. I think Mike, you and I both identified when we were doing our predictions, a number of our predictions were predicated on the base that these teams are going to be making moves. So if these teams change their mind or things over the course of the season don't work out the way they thought in terms of trades, then sometimes those predictions look really silly. But yeah, we're projecting right now and saying, yeah, like Colby Barlow likely is not going to be an Owen Sound attack player in a couple months. And we do that across the league. So yeah, the first third of the season is a very different animal than the second 2/3.
Just in keeping with the theme that we started on in this episode of the OHL podcast, acknowledging again how early it is and how different that makes these games in terms of their value overall. I would still want to emphasize, I did this on the broadcast from Windsor on Saturday night. I want to do it here too. When the Windsor Spitfires and Ethan Belchetz come to your city, you might want to consider scraping together the 20 or 25 or $30 to go and watch him play. Even if he's going to score 4 and have 2 assists in a fight, like do the Ethan Belchetz hat trick against your team. Because this guy is something else. Somebody else pointed out or suggested on social media on the weekend that this is the Big E not Eric, but Ethan 2.0. I mean, that's pretty lofty for a guy that's played 3 Ontario Hockey League games, but I would argue certainly worth the price of admission. And you can see him in this league for the next couple of years for 25 or so bucks, or you can see him for 250 or more in the National League when he inevitably ends up there. So I just want to throw that in there and make sure any fan, because we've had all of our markets check in, when the Spits come to town, might be worth shelling out for a ticket when that happens. Something else I noticed on opening weekend, Dan, and I wanted to get into a little bit more. I will read this directly, what came out from the Ontario Hockey League on Friday night as the first full weekend was getting underway. And the tweet, do we still call them, are they X's now? I don't even, anyway,
Yeah, good question.
I don't
Yeah.
know. Elon Musk is making my life miserable. Can I just say that? Anyway, the tweet went out as follows. In accordance with regulations governing OHL preseason play, the London Knights have exercised their option to pay a $500 fine in exchange for the second game of player Ryder Bolton's 2-game suspension. He is eligible to play in tonight's game. We can get into the conspiracy theories or any arguments about favoritism if we want to. We will get into that. However, at face value, this is something I'm not sure I've ever seen from the Ontario Hockey League. And I am absolutely here for it because casual observers of the game, knowing that Ryder Bolton had a 2-game suspension, and then seeing him in the lineup for the Knights opening game would be going, what the HE double hockey sticks is happening here? Why are the London Knights getting this favoritism from the league, et cetera, et cetera? The league made it very clear in advance that this is within regulations. The Knights have exercised this option and paid that $500 fine, and the kid gets to play. You don't have to love the rule, but it was explained to you in advance. I think that is a fantastic way to engage fans in the game, and I hope the league keeps it coming. That started this way, let's keep it going this way all season long.
Definitely. It sure raised some eyebrows seeing that kind of information come out. And I say, why not even take it a step further and give us some information on what types of things can be bought back? Or is there a fee schedule? Like this one's $500, this one's $1,000. I don't just the more information, the better. There's a lot of thirst for knowledge out there and it explains things for us. So we know exactly what the scenario is. And that way, if you're a player like me and your team does not buy back your services for a game later in the season, you know where you stand on the roster, right?
Yeah, that's right. No, what? Buy back Mahar's suspension? No way we're doing that, right? Just leave him up there in the press box with Farwell. Perfect place for him.
Exactly. Forget that $500.
I love where you're going with that, though, in terms of the more that could be added to this, right? Because, again, I'll just reference it because I said it earlier. I've been in this league 20 plus years. I could not tell you offhand what a buybackable, if you will, suspension is. I do remember for all of the conspiracy theorists out there, okay, who think that the London Knights are getting preferential treatment here. I do remember way back, this goes back to the Pete DeBoer era with the Kitchener Rangers, but I remember a game because I was asking the questions before the game. Wait a minute, that player is suspended. Oh yeah, the Rangers bought it back. The Rangers are also a team, obviously, with the financial wherewithal to do that. And we can argue the merits of having a buyback option when the financial playing field is not necessarily level across the league. Fair enough. I don't think $500 is too onerous to any owner. But the point is, I heard this happen before. I didn't know it was even a thing, but it's not just London that has exercised it historically. It won't just be London that exercises it moving forward. Yes, the league could share a little bit more of what kind of suspension can be bought back. Are there different tiers of fine associated with various violations, et cetera? In the bigger picture, Dan, I don't know how you feel about it, but I'm not sure I'm entirely comfortable with the idea that a suspension can be bought back. So the league says this is a 2-game suspension unless you give us $500 and then it's not a 2-game suspension anymore. I don't know how much I love that, to be honest.
The part that troubles me probably the most about it, Mike, is just what you referenced earlier, is the financial might of different teams. It's like $500 to London is pocket change. To some teams, it's maybe a little more. It little more impactful. And they might not have the means to say that early in the season that we can buy this back. So because there's such a disparity in the economics from the various teams, I don't love the buyback concept. Having said that, I also understand the fans pay to see the players. The fans that are buying tickets want to, so you don't want players missing games for frivolous suspensions and frivolous reasons. So I don't mind the concept of there being a hierarchy of the suspendable offense. But you have to wonder if it's buybackable, should it be suspendable in the first place? There's a few questions that come to mind, but I don't love the financial aspect.
And in this particular case, I'm glad you brought that up. I don't want to trivialize the league's rules and make it sound too frivolous, but in this case, Ryder Bolton's 2-game suspension was for taking off his helmet. Like, so if you're going to buy back something, sure, buy back the second game of that, right? Somebody else suggested on Twitter or X when the league posted this that the payment for the violation should go to the player who was wronged. Now, I guess in this case, when you remove your helmet, no, you were the player. So I don't think Ryder Bolton's going to collect the $500 for his own suspension. I don't think this is the kind of league where we want to get into that sort of thing, but I don't know. And then should the league be giving us an accounting of where the $500 gets spent? I don't think we need to get to that level of detail, but I did think the idea of paying the fine to the player who was wronged was the worst idea I've ever heard. It's a talking point anyway.
Yeah, I think the trouble there is I don't think too many buybackable offenses are ones where players are injured or wrong too badly. They tend to be the more soft type penalties like you're describing. So for me, if I were going to go down that route, Mike, I'd almost prefer to have it go to some sort of charitable cause. Why not? Some sort of children's cause. Let's make this a positive. It's small dollars anyway. So I'd rather go that route than get into the politics of owing it to a player who wasn't really a victim in the case of these suspensions.
I thought the very same thing when the idea was floated. Why not? And the Canadian Mental Health Association with the Talk Today program that's a part of the Ontario Hockey League might be a great landing place if it was to be given to a charitable organization. But you're right. I think what this comes back to is the idea that, okay, you according to league regulations, as was explained by the league, which is awesome, this is something you could buy back. Well, what makes it that? Or what are the suspensions that can be bought back? So we're like 90% there. We're light years ahead of where we were even a season ago. Keep it up, and maybe if there's an opportunity to make us even more aware or give us a better understanding of what those suspensions that can be bought back are, then we're more than happy to hear it. But I'm encouraged by the way this season is starting as far as this is concerned, because we got that on Friday night. Just today, on the day of our recording, there were 3 more social media posts by the Ontario Hockey League documenting discipline that had been handed out to various players, 2-game suspensions to this player, that player, and the other player. And I always wondered historically if the league wasn't forthcoming with this because they didn't want to have the reputation of a league where players are being suspended frequently. And I can understand why you might be a little bit wary of running that risk, if you will. But again, I'm going to come back to, if you want to engage fans in your game, give them information so they understand what's going on. And when they show up to the game and player X, Y, or Z is not there, they know why. That's the way it should be.
100%. If I'm a big fan of erring on the side of over communicating, especially when you're asking fans to invest themselves in your league. And for years, I heard a lot of puzzlement walking into these rinks about, why is this player suspended? Why is when are they going to announce the suspension? The incident happened 5 days ago. And when you have fans aggravated at a lack of communication from the head office, that's not a good thing. There's lots of reasons fans will be aggravated with your league. Maybe they disagree with the way a rule is applied. Maybe they're angry about something that happened on the ice. Do not give them a reason to be angry over lack of communication from the head office. So that's consistently, I think, been a your and I message to the league, Mike, and it's good to see that they're stepping up in that regard.
The fans are absolutely your number one stakeholders. Treat them as though they were the most important commodity that you have. I think it's a great start to this level of transparency from the league. All right, speaking of starts, we are back for a new regular season. And that means on every episode of this OHL podcast, we will share with you our prospect of the week, which is the player that is NHL draft eligible next June of 2025 that we think had the best week in this Ontario Hockey League. So we're on our way to that in just a moment. But I want to remind you that this episode of the OHL podcast is brought to you by BetterHelp. It is never too late for a back to school era. You remember when you were a kid and you had this great sense of wonder about things? Doesn't it seem, I mean, at least it seems to me that we lose that in adulthood. But it's never really too late to recapture that sense of wonder. And you can probably accomplish that through therapy. And I know what you're thinking. No, therapy's not for me, or it's too expensive for me. But I'm not the kind of person that would ever go to therapy. Remember that when it comes to therapy, it's not as though you have to have experienced some major trauma. This is just something that can teach you some coping skills, help you set boundaries in your life. And if you're thinking about, well, maybe this kind of therapy isn't the worst idea, then you should think about giving BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. You can suit it to your own schedule. It's designed to be flexible. And all you have to do is fill out a brief questionnaire and you'll be matched with a licensed therapist. Rediscover your curiosity with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/THPN today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/THPN. Which NHL draft eligible prospect helped their team the most this opening weekend of the season? I don't think we're going to have the same one, Dan. Maybe we will, but I feel I like my reason, says I to myself. I really like the reasons I picked the guy that I did. Who do you have as your prospect of the week this week?
Wow, I didn't think there's gonna be a whole lot of mystery behind mine. I had to give the nod to Michael Misa, who's probably going to get a few nods this week. But when you score 7 goals in your first 3 games, 8 points, hard to ignore a guy that's likely going top 5 in the NHL draft and played like it this week. So not a huge shock, I'm sure, Mike, but I went with Misa. Who you got?
Well, and see, so I did too. I thought you might go because to me, and the reason I was hesitant for a moment is because this is the guy that's in his 3rd year now because he was granted exceptional status to come into this league. So, oh yeah, guys, really stretch it out. Like, take Michael Misa as your prospect of the week. But so obviously 7 goals in your first 3 games, add an assist. He's got the good Cy Young going there at 7-1, right? But I think that the fact that we really haven't been having these kinds of conversations about Michael Misa in his first 2 years, right? Like I recognize the injury in his rookie year for sure. He played like 45 games, right? But even last year with and maybe it's because it's such a stacked roster that was built to win a Memorial Cup, but his younger brother, Luke, outpointed him. So there was that aspect of it too. And so here we are now starting in the draft year, arguably the most important of Michael Misa's junior career. And he is absolutely making a statement early. You talk about going top 5. Head coach of Saginaw, Chris Lazary, says Michael Misa is going to be in the conversation for number 1 overall. Now, that's what a head coach is supposed to say. I get that. But the performance certainly was something else. Those 7 goals in 3 games is the most in Saginaw Spirit history in the first 3 games of a season. Michael Berner had the previous record of 6 back in 05-06. And to put it in a different light, granted, Saginaw has played 3 games so far. Most other teams have only played 2. But Michael Misa's 7 goals all by himself is more than half the teams in the league have scored so far this season. I'll include the Kitchener Rangers in that, watching them score 2 goals in each of their first 2 games. So the Rangers as a team have 4, and Michael Misa has 7. So yes, I am also taking Michael Misa as my inaugural prospect of the week. I think there were a few ways to go. And I think, Dan, that we are, like when I'm looking down the list of draft eligibles, we're in for a treat in this league, aren't we, this year? Matthew Schaefer, pardon me, we know he's out right now, but when he comes back and hopefully fully healthy, Cameron Reed, another defenseman who's an absolute stud, Jack-Ivan Kovic, the goaltender, who I was also considering this week, Porter Martone, Malcolm Spence. It's a hell of a year in the Ontario Hockey League.
When we talk about these names, Mike, in some cases it's hard to believe these are draft eligibles. I know a couple of them are late birthdays. They had to wait next year to get their NHL draft, but some of these kids seem like they've been stars in this league for a year or two already, and they're just draft eligible now. So yeah, it's an embarrassment of riches for the OHL this year. Pretty much every kid you just named, with the exception of Cameron Reed, might slip a little, but the other ones all projecting to be top 10 picks in the NHL. All of those projected to be top round picks. And there's a number of others in this league this year that are well worth watching. And we know how it works every year, right, Mike? You see at the start of the year, the ratings, there's 2 or 3 kids, and by the end, there's someone has just shot up the ranks, like Beckett Seneca last year. You see it every year. Jet Luchenko jumped way up the scale. That's going to happen this year too. Unfortunately, it probably means someone slides down a little too, but someone's going to come out of the woodwork. And just on the Michael Misa topic too, when you talk about potential #1 overall, well, so was Porter Martone, potential #1 overall. And you look at the previous years when you referenced his point totals and figuring out what he was in this league. Don't discount the immense pressure Michael Misa too. Exceptional player status, like trying to live up to these massive expectations on a loaded roster like you referenced, so you're not necessarily getting all the reps and all the chances that you normally would if you were playing on a lesser team. So he's had a lot to live up to, and oftentimes the player has to be 18, 19 in this league before they figure out what they are, and it sure looks like he's figured something out this year.
And not to take anything away from Shane Wright, who was the exceptional player in between Misa now and Connor McDavid before Shane Wright, but I found myself thinking back on Connor McDavid because when he came into this league, there was, and see, you can't even really blame, if you will, the market because McDavid was an Erie, Misa obviously in Saginaw. So is there enough attention? Well, there was plenty of attention around Connor McDavid from day one. And for me, again, I feel like I'm picking on the kid and it's not fair, but it just didn't seem to me that there was the same amount of buzz or Michael Misa was doing kind of Connor McDavid exceptional player type things from the moment he stepped into this league, right? So that's just where kind of my head was at, and it also made me remember that in all of his years, albeit just 3 of them, Connor McDavid also never led his team, the Erie Otters, in scoring. So Michael Misa, don't worry about that. Although he's off to a hell of a start, he's going to lead the Saginaw Spirit in scoring this year.
Definitely. And I think it's funny that you referenced that, Mike, with the exceptional status and the buzz around some of these kids. You know what fans love to do too, right? I've seen it every time there's been an exceptional status player in this league, when dating back to Jason Spezza and Sean Day. And you see these players come into the league, and what do you hear the fans around the rink? Oh, he's not that good. I was expecting, it's like they hear this term exceptional status and they expect to come to the rink and see this kid put up a Belchetz like performance every night. These kids are exceptional. They're coming in at 15, folks. They're not going to dominate necessarily. Connor McDavid is in another planet. Most of them are going to come in, and the reason they're exceptional is a maturity in their game. Tend to be strong skaters. They tend to be physically large enough to play against peers much older. So there's certain things that scouts see in their game say that, yeah, they're okay to play at this level at this stage, but it doesn't mean they're walking into a good league like the Ontario Hockey League and putting up 5-6 points a night. So, but we all love to carve those kids down, right? And say, well, oh, look at the arrogance of applying for exceptional status. I was expecting better. It's a tough league, and you're not going to generally do a whole lot to stand out till you're a little bit older.
Not to make this episode a love letter entirely to Ethan Belchetz, but just because you mentioned that maturity again, I did get a chance to speak to Belchetz before the game on Saturday night. I'd play the audio for you on this podcast, but I did a terrible interview. Like me, it was all on me. I did not prepare well enough for it. But his answers and the way he phrased them, like the maturity just oozed out of him. And I'm thinking to myself in the back of my mind as I'm talking to him, 16 years old. Like if I could have been so poised at 16, but he was a great interview. And I know I can just already imagine the conversations we're going to be having about Ethan Belchetz next year when he's in his draft year. Back to the Misa point and exceptional players and what we tend to expect of them, Dan. It's such a good point. I remember when Aaron Ekblad was in this league as an exceptional player, and with the Eastern Conference, I only would get to see him live twice. And I remember the first time, and I watched him and thought, this is what we get for an exceptional player. And then I don't think Aaron Ekblad needs any endorsement from me based on what he's done. He might have been having an off night. I wasn't thoroughly impressed that first time, but there are a ton of other factors at play here. And I wonder, do you think I'm getting a bit onto a tangent here, but are we done seeing exceptional players? Do you think?
I don't think, and the reason I
No?
don't think, Mike, is because players get so much training and off-ice grooming that we've always got a handful of players at every cohort that are flirting with that status. And I think when you have a league that has so much competition like the OHL does now, from the USHL, from NCAA, if they can have a leg up by granting these players the status to get them into their league earlier and get them signed, I think it's something they're going to seriously explore. Why would you not grant it to a kid that wants it and by most accounts is ready for it if that means you can lock that player into your league, knowing that in some cases these guys are going to be gone at 18 or 19 anyway. So I don't think we've seen the end of it, Mike.
The political aspect of it is the part that I'm least comfortable with, because we know there's a whole lot of essentially negotiating that goes on before that status is granted to a player. But I like your rationale for why it may continue. So the exceptional Michael Misa, I guess it's unanimous, Dan. The OHL podcast has declared Misa the prospect of the week.
I think you have to. 7 goals in 3 games. That pretty much, if that doesn't get you the nod, I don't know what does.
We are in for a fun season watching these draft eligible players and continuing these conversations with you. Remember to be a part of them. Send an email anytime. OHL podcast at Rogers.com. Find Dan on Twitter at his name, Dan Mahar. I'm at Farwell _OHL. And we will be back in your ears 1 week from today on the OHL podcast.